mopanda. Napasi oyo ya boye kai na pana mawa na kokate. Basusu oyo na bonaka bawela bokonzi pena babwatilio. Bavoti tango ekomaka kai na komi moto pona bango.
Okay, greetings to everybody. And thank you for responding at such short notice to this event, an unusual policy dialogue, to remind us that we are first and foremost political animals, activists, as we have been since we became adults. Pan-African solidarity, meeting with democratic forces in Sudan. I want to thank the co-sponsor of this, that's Abdullahi Batili, who posted something the day before, yesterday morning, on Sudan, and began consulting with him, and we decided to have this very short notice. And we have tried to get as many people as possible in the short time available. So somewhat, we're not surprised that we don't have everybody that we were expecting, but enough, especially those of you who are already on the platform. So I would want to say too much, was I think Bayo Olukoshi, one of our young luminaries, not so young now, but certainly younger than me. So to outline the problematic for us and introduce us to the topic. And we are hoping that he will also explain the context. Thanks, Bayo.
Thank you very much indeed, Ibu, and thank you for putting this together at short notice. I am delighted to be here in the midst of friends, colleagues, comrades, in a certain sense, providing us an opportunity collectively to exhale, as it were, in the face of the events that have been unfolding in the Sudan over the last 48, 72 hours, and which are still very much ongoing as the struggle for enthroning a proper democratic transition in that country continues. And I would like to probably start by putting this in what I would call a broader context that situates the situation of the Sudan within a global system that is very much itself in transition from a post-1945 world order to something which is still very much in the making, but which in the context of the loss of certainty and clarity amongst a whole range of issues which might have been considered to be settled, including questions of governance. We are witnessing an increasing emboldening of anti-democratic forces. The broad context for that emboldening, I think, emerged already in the period from the late 1970s, that period that marked the ascendancy on a global scale of neoliberalism and its ascendancy to a position of hegemony, which basically underneath it was a determination not only on a doctrinal basis to roll back the state, but also to contain politics, insofar as politics was seen as disruptive of the primary objective of instituting economic rationality, governed by peculiar ideas about the role and place of the market and how it would restore a proper ordering of values in society and allocation of resources. And this global neoliberalism, of course, took a huge toll on our continent, which, like Latin America and parts of Asia, served as the huge experimental ground for many things which were initially experimented with, as we know, in Chile, but which found a huge field across the global south, much of the global south, and became refracted into the broad practice of policy that we have witnessed over the last 30 years or so. At the height of neoliberalism, just to underscore its anti-democratic core, you will recall that the chief economist of the World Bank Africa Department at the time, when questioned about the interface between political reforms that were beginning to manifest themselves on the continent, culminating in the National Conference in Benin Republic, and the continuation of austerity. In his defense of the structural adjustment programs, he insisted that effective, ruthless governments able to ride roughshod on public opinion were clearly needed in order to continue to implement structural adjustments. So that much of what we then saw subsequently has been a struggle for the containment of the boundaries of democratization. It is juncture, as it were, on the one hand, between the quest for so-called rational economic policies to be enthroned as a permanent condition of policy making on a global scale, and particularly in the countries of the global south, and the quest by citizens for an opening up of the political space and the necessary empowerment that will enable participation and also exact accountability. And that disjuncture has played itself out in various forms over the period since the 1990s, when our entry into the so-called third wave of global democratization has gathered momentum. And it didn't really take too long for things to begin to come to a head. Initially, within the first decade, with all of the investments made in the mechanics of democratization, election management bodies, some constitutionalism, and so on and so forth. Citizens were soon to realize that much of what happened in formal politics did not really have a bearing on struggles for the improvement of livelihoods. And policy, in any case, did not appear to shift, regardless of whatever alternation in political power took place in most of our countries, which is what prompted the late Thandika Mkandawire to draw attention to what he described at the time as the emergence in Africa of choiceless democracies. Democracies, governments, regimes that effectively were voted into power on the basis of commitments that they made, manifesto commitments that they made to redress a range of issues of a structural and conjunctural nature in society, but which upon arriving in office found themselves effectively constrained and then compelled to stick to a particular script, a neoliberal script of how to govern the economy and society, and which in turn meant that ultimately, in the face of that choicelessness, the political space began gradually to close and a new authoritarianism began to rear its head. In the context of the crisis in the Sudan, we had a government which, of course, was managing a multiplicity of conflicts during the Bashir years, which ordinarily would qualify as the kind of effective and ruthless regime which the World Bank chief economist for Africa at the time said was needed to implement structural adjustments. but which also was dealing with sanctions connected to its management of domestic crisis and conflict, particularly in Darfur, as well as pressures for conformity with the requirements of the so-called global war on terror. So in many respects, it was a regime which, in retrospect, we can argue, in spite of all of its appearances of strength, was actually living on borrowed time. And matters were not helped for it by the rapid and continued deterioration of the domestic economic and social conditions, which effectively came to a head and compelled citizens to take to the streets, demanding an end to the Bashir regime. That regime was in power for 30 years, so obviously it had sunk some roots in the structures of politics and governance. What I think following the fall of Bashir, we came to refer to, without necessarily following the analogy of the Trumpian politics of recent times, as the deep state, as the elements of the Bashir state that had become embedded both in politics, even in economy and in society, from which the military was not exempt. And the intervention which the military made in the wake of the persistent and unyielding demand of people for an end to the dictatorship of the Bashir years and the installation of a proper process of democratization in the country. The military intervention which took place was actually an opportunistic intervention designed by many of those who were made by Bashir and were enforcers for Bashir to hold on to whatever they could hold on to, whilst giving an appearance of abandoning General Bashir himself. And as you will recall, they immediately announced the setting up of a military transitional council, which they expected would mollify the population as long as Bashir was written out of the new power equation. Citizens read through it and organized groups, including formal institutions represented by the professionals, but also street-level organizers, rejected the military transitional council and continued with the campaign, not only for an end to military rule, but to remove the military completely from the political arena, from direct involvement in politics. And as you recall, in the ensuing struggle, not less than, at least as far as we know officially, not less than 1,800 Sudanese civilians were killed by the military in their effort to break the will of the people. And ultimately realizing that this was not going to happen, there was a concession to create a power sharing arrangement within the framework of a sovereign council, complete with an agreement for the rotation of power between the civilian and military components of the transitional council, and also to prepare the transition over a 3-year period initially towards a fully democratic and elected government. Unfortunately, I think it was also clear from the outset, and not a few of the civilian actors who are involved in the transitional process were fully aware that what the compromise represented was one which was going to produce a period of relative instability for the country. And managing that instability in many respects has been the stuff of which politics in the period since this fall of Bashir and the appointment of Abdallah Hamdok as Prime Minister has been. At one level, it has been an effort to ensure that the civilian face of government remained solidly united behind the vision of the revolution. And where possible, also share the strategic approach for both defending and carrying forward the goals of the popular struggle that led to the fall of Bashir. The second level was to establish proper authority over the institutions of civic governance, which basically, at least in terms of the agreement, appeared to have been conceded to the office of the Prime Minister, and reorganizing government and introducing a new set of not just officials, but also of policy priorities, clearly consumed an important part of the energies of the civilian component. Whereas the military insisted during the negotiations that matters military would be completely out of the purview of the civilian component of the administration. Inevitably, I would argue, the Prime Minister in particular and elements of his government had absolutely no possibility to be completely immune to or absent from developments in the armed forces, especially because at one level, they needed, as part of the stabilization, post-Bashir stabilization of the country, to conclude agreements with the various armed groups across the country, contesting this authority of Khartoum, and which, even if they welcomed the departure of Omar el-Bashir, did not necessarily prepare themselves to lay down their arms following the arrival of the transitional government. So bringing them into the political process and committing them to a transition program was as much a priority for Abdallah Hamdok and his team as for any other actor in the Sovereign Council, including the head of the armed forces and the official head of state. Many of the armed groups did not trust the army, and a lot of the delays actually in the negotiation of peace agreements with some of the groups, including some whose leaders were in exile in neighboring countries, owed to the fact that confidence measures had to be put in place to assure them that the Prime Minister's office and team were not acting at the behest of the army, certainly not at the behest of General Burhan or his deputy Hemeti, who is a much dreaded and disdained figure, going back to at the heart of the dictatorship of the Bashir years, but that this was part of a renewed national effort to rebuild the country and forge a more stable path forward into the future. Now, any agreement with the peace, any peace agreement with the various groups clearly would have implications for the workings of the armed forces. And that's why I said inevitably, Abdallah Hamdok and team could not stay out of developments within the armed forces. Within the non-insurgent groups, armed groups across the country, within the regular armed forces, if I may call it that way, to the extent to which one can call it the regular armed forces, there were also factions. There were factions which remain to this day, divided roughly for analytic purposes into the mainstream armed forces and the militias, the various militias. As of the time of the fall of Bashir, analysts, some of them, the Sudanese analysts, pointed to the fact that as part of his survival strategy, Omar al-Bashir actually had up to 6 armies, so to speak, up to 6 armies, including the militia groups that were very heavily armed. And perhaps the most powerful of those militia groups being the one led by the so-called deputy chair of the Sovereign Council. There's no provision in the transitional agreement for a deputy chair of the council, but Burhan did appoint a deputy unilaterally soon after the transition began. And that deputy, Hemeti, as is popularly called, leading one of the most powerful militia groups, very heavily armed, and also himself contesting the authority of the mainstream army out of which Burhan emerged, and managing that tension also in order for the business of government to be able to take place effectively, I think necessarily involved Abdallah. And at the third level, still on the military, was the fact that the different components that made up Bashir's military support base themselves were allied to external powers, powers external to the Sudan, partly sometimes dependent on the places from which Bashir sought military hardware in order to support those militia groups. And here, for example, apart from the Emiratis, Saudi Arabia, we also had Egypt, which has a historic relationship with the Sudan, sharing an extensive border. And you have Turkey, and to some extent, I would add Russia and China as players also in the overall power equation, with different sections of the armed forces apparently allied to them. And even in the heat of some of the conflicts between factions of the army, as recently as 3 months ago, we had Hemeti going to seek consultation in Turkey, whilst Burhan headed to the Emiratis, competing for support in order to bolster their positions in what was clearly an emerging power conflict. And that was the context within which Abdallah's historic press conference was called, which he spoke candidly to the people of the Sudan about the need for unity, not only of purpose, not only between the civilian and military factions, but also particularly within the military itself. And the 6-point plan, which he put forward to govern the transition and tide the country over from a situation of intense power struggle that was becoming more and more volatile, apparently was accepted by all of the key actors, but only in order to reposition themselves for the ultimate showdown. So I think this broad background is, of course, for the Prime Minister complicated by the terrible economic situation that the government inherited after the departure of Bashir. And I'm sure we're all aware of the steps that were taken to lift sanctions. That was an important part of the work of the Prime Minister in the early years, in the early months of the transition. And to begin to also get some debt relief and ultimately attract significant injections of capital, of money into the economy to begin to aid the process of reconstruction after so many years of sanctions. But in the interim, as all of these went on, the economy itself hemorrhaged quite a lot, symbolized particularly by the collapse of the Sudanese pound, and with it an erosion in the conditions of living of the population that led some to take to the streets to protest the inaction of the transitional government. During my last visit to Khartoum, and I had a chance November last year to spend some time with the Prime Minister. It was remarkable that on the wall leading to his office, the graffitis in Arabic covered the entire wall, a lot of them very insulting of the transitional government and of the Prime Minister. And we took a photo on the wall, and he said he basically took the attitude to say, let people express themselves, because if we were in their situation too, we would actually be protesting the collapse in living conditions and standards. And the security forces should not stop people who want to exhale, who want to express their frustration from doing so, understanding that this is part of the responsibility that he had. But it became, I think, also an avenue. This economic and social situation became an avenue for a regrouping of anti-democratic forces, some of them acting in the name of Bashir to particularly try to prevent the extradition of Bashir to the ICC for trial, and perhaps also win back a significant position in the process of governance, in the system of governance. And on the other hand, for the military, a section of the military led by Burhan, who continuing a trend of unilateral action without consultation, either with the civilian members of the Sovereign Council or the Prime Minister. And it's not just the appointment of Hemeti, for example, but it's also the meeting, secret meeting which he had with Benjamin Netanyahu, which took the Prime Minister off guard. He was not informed about it. He read about it, asked questions directly of Burhan, and Burhan basically said it was a question of timing, given the sensitivities and all of that. That faction too had itself increasingly made it clear that it was not going to be open to scrutiny and questioning on an endless basis by a Prime Minister who, on the one hand, was feeling pressures from below to deliver more quickly to the populace, particularly the youth, and on the other hand, found himself increasingly hamstrung from above by unilateral steps taken by Burhan. As part of the effort to loosen up the grip of the military, quite surprisingly, I think for me at least, my belief for other observers, was his success in actually getting the military to transfer some of the economic institutions, including industries that they had controlled throughout the Bashir years, as part of what one might call a Sudanese version of the military-industrial complex, over to the government, to the Prime Minister's cabinet, and for more effective civilian control over sections of the economy. But nevertheless, the overarching situation that evolved in the last few weeks was one of an intensifying power struggle, both within the armed forces and within the civilian and military component of the Sovereign Council, to a point where sections of the army began to orchestrate their own demonstrations, almost like a rent-a-crowd situation, including the sit-in at the presidency, which Burhan used to justify, in part, the coup that was launched. So, colleagues, in a very rough way, this is what I'd like to contribute to our conversation, and for us to perhaps, against this background, begin to see ways in which, at one level, we can support the democratic forces in Sudan in what I think is clearly a titanic battle that will determine the direction of the country for a very long time to come. The democratic forces are very clear that nothing less than the total departure of the military from the political scene will do. The military have basically thrown the gauntlet and said they will confiscate full power in order to manage the transition. If they get away with the coup, the next set of actions that will come from them, I think, is fairly obvious to us. And it is clear that even when a transition would take place in 2023, it would not be the kind of transition for which many Sudanese have sacrificed, men and women, not only in seeing Bashir off the scene, but also in taking a lot of social and economic pain in expectation that ultimately the kind of government they would want to see and hold accountable will be instituted down the line. That is likely to be lost. And I think being able to find a way to solidarize with and support the democratic forces in Sudan is one of the most important forms of contribution which we can make. And at the present time, of course, the telecoms to the country are a bit difficult. Establish contact with the Prime Minister, who are able to reach some of his staff who have access to equipment that is not directly within national control, but hopefully it would be possible also down the line to be able to get some input from within Sudan itself in terms of the kind of solidarity that they would expect from friends and allies around the world, including the African continent. Thank you very much, Ibo. Let me stop here. And I'm sorry if I went on for a bit.
No, it was necessary. Very useful. Give us the context, the background, and your own intimate knowledge of the Sudanese situation. Before I call on Eleanor, who's next, I would just want to make some, give some feedback from some of our panelists. Dzodzi has sent a message. Dzodzi Chikata from Legon, Ghana. She's in class, teacher. We have academics here, but she's in full support of this meeting. Likewise, Funmi from Nigeria sends her apologies. She'll join us after the lecture. I'd like also to welcome Dr. Jok, Madhu Jok from South Sudan. And I hope that perhaps you'd have the chance to, you'd welcome the opportunity to say something on the Sudan. In particular, the points raised by Bayo. What are the chances of rolling back this evolving coup? What are the chances of a successful return to civilian rule in 2023? And thirdly, what do we do in the event that things get worse as they appear to be? The good news, though, is that good news, but not so good, is that Hamdok was returned to his home together with his wife after days in General Buran's house, but is under very strict house arrest, but he is safe at the moment. Many of us remember Hamdok. He was with us at SAPIS 1998 to 2000 with the Regional Human Development Report, after which he went to ECA. So, and significantly, we have shared notes on the Transitional Authority, which they put in place in 2019, but about which we warned some of us that the inclusion of the military would be problematic but perhaps that reflects the hegemonic role of the military in a country in which the military military rule had become institutionalized. So I'll call upon Dr. Jog subsequently, but now I call on Eleanor Sisulu. Eleanor is a well-known Zimbabwean South African, and happily my relative too. And she has been an active member of this forum. And I also ambushed her, took her for granted, and I knew that she would live up to the occasion to join us. When we talked about the Sudan situation the other day, she was very distressed. And so I knew that she would welcome the opportunity to be part of this expression of solidarity with democratic forces in Sudan. Eleanor?
Thank you very much, Ibo, and I'm glad I'm speaking after Bayo's very extensive analysis. So I don't need to add anything to that. And I'm not speaking from a position of great knowledge and authority, just speaking emotionally as an African at this assault on democracy in Sudan. I found it particularly distressing because in 2019, I was part of the crisis action campaign on Sudan to support the democratic forces and to fight for the AU not to recognize the post-al-Bashir regime and to fight for a democratic regime in Sudan. And I particularly remember the courage of the young people, especially the young women activists. And when this happened, I was just thinking of how hard and long they fought, how intense that battle was, only for it to come to this. I think that we are in a moment of such fatigue. This pandemic has brought about such fatigue and actually undermined the capacity for solidarity in so many ways. We in South Africa are assailed with our national problems. We have the crisis in Swaziland next door, and the pandemic has made it very difficult to effectively mount any kind of solidarity campaign. The kind of solidarity apparatus we had a few years ago or a decade ago seemed to be dissipated. So I also think that partly this coup, one of the factors was that the regime, it's a moment when people are preoccupied with their own business and that they could get away with doing something like this. I really don't have much to add except that the preoccupation of what can we do? And I'm glad that there is a Pan-African gathering such as this one to talk about solidarity. And even, I mean, the lowest hanging fruit, I think, is a joint statement from this group to which we sign off on, because I think the value of a collective voice, some may dismiss this as just, you know, being a token, but I think it's a start at least to have a statement from activists across the continent that there's value to that. And I suppose, you know, it's so difficult to talk about doing something within our own respective countries, but I think we at least can try. You know, we are in a situation of having elections next week, local government elections in South Africa, something which I think is personally totally unnecessary and untimely, having an election during the pandemic. But so October the 30th, the day of mass mobilization within South Sudan and internationally, may pass by unnoticed here, but I think the few of us that are here will do what we can to get some kind of media coverage and maybe see if there can be some kind of solidarity action at the local level here in South Africa. Apart from that, I mean, I'm just interested in hearing from others what kind of continental solidarity actions we can carry out. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thank you, Abu. I hope as we go on with the meeting, we can have some ideas as to what action to take from here, what resolution to take from here. I thought I saw one of one of our panelists, Idayat Hassan from CDD, Nigeria. Is she still with us? I'd like to call on her after Karin. And I'd like also to welcome Patricia Rodney. Patricia, I haven't seen you since the 80s, but welcome, Patricia Rodney from the Caribbean. Yes, don't ask the question. Yes, that's the Walter Rodney, his partner, widow. Karin, are you ready now? Karin is director of Human Rights Watch, based in DC. Karin Nantulia from Burundi, where sadly she's not been to the country since 2004, for the same reasons that many of our people out there in the diaspora. So Karin, can you come in?
Thank you, Ibo. And can you hear me?
Yes, thanks. Can hear you.
It's an honor and a privilege to be with all of you. I know some of you, others I don't. But I guess it's in times like this where we get to have this moment where we share ideas, but we also share sorrows as we think about the best way of helping brothers and sisters from different countries. And today we will be talking about Sudan. I just wanted to share quick anecdote. In 2015, an unknown civil servant who was working for the Burundian government at that time decided to resign out of the blue. And when people spoke and asked the civil servant why that person had resigned, he had this to say. He said he had realized in the middle of the night before he resigned, that Africa was going through its third struggle. And he explained the three struggles. So the first one was obviously when our forefathers and grandfathers fought against colonialism and slavery. The second era was when we fought to get rid of military coups. And the third one is really, according to this civil servant, was really about the institutionalization of people's dignity and human rights. And when this discussion was taking place, that the civil servant ended up in a refugee camp in one of the neighboring countries. We met again in Banjul when we were sitting with Sudanese protesters. Eleanor mentioned the young women and men who were so courageous and paid a high price for the aspirations for democratization and freedom. And during that conversation between that person, the civil servant, and the Sudanese protesters who had been in a sit-in for weeks at that time, we got to realize how humanity is the same. The struggles that some are going through, you find them in another country. But most importantly, that indeed history repeats itself. And at the same time, we realize that one of the the struggles of our time are now led by young people. In the same way they were launched decades ago by young people as well. So the question now, I think, for us is how do we bring out the solidarity we had decades ago? In the same way you had, and I'm saying this, I think, I'm thinking aloud in terms of what Eleanor and you, Ibu, said, you know, what are the actions that we can put forward? And if we attempt to remember how it was in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, would it be too ambitious for us? And this is a question I'm asking myself and I'm asking all of us. Would it be too ambitious to think of how do we engage continental institutions like the African Union in the same way at some point there was a committee that was really gathering resources and expertise and knowledge around how to fight against apartheid, the apartheid regime. Yes, joint statements, but at the same time, how do we sustain these actions at a continental level? We might not be able to engage. All of us might not be able to engage with our countries, but some of us might. Some of us might be able to engage with different governments who are within the African Union. That's one. The other thing is, how do we amass how do we collect a critical mass of citizens to actually, if possible, support physically on the ground Sudanese brothers and sisters, and finally, how do we keep scrutiny? How do we keep the scrutiny on the dynamics, the political dynamics on the ground, and how do we make sure that ultimately the forces of change remain at the forefront of the politics of transformation in Sudan? These are big questions that we hopefully will be able to answer. And again, it's very glad and very honored to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. Thank you. One of the things that prompted this meeting is a real one, namely the safety and security of Hamdok and his colleagues in government who have been under house arrest. And Bayo just told us 1,800 citizens perished as part of the process that led to the removal of Bashir. We cannot allow that to continue. We have to do everything possible to ensure the security and safety of the forces of change in Sudan. And when we heard that Hamdok and his family had been, and several other members of the transitional government had been whisked away by the military, I think the measure of public reaction internationally, in Africa, and including ourselves, will and should assist in restraining the military, but in particular saving our comrades there. Dr. Jock, I hope you're on standby. I'll be calling on you. But before I do that, can those of our panelists who are here on this platform, they perhaps can recognize them because they're using either the phone. Please identify yourself as we move forward. And I want to call on Idayat Hassan, if she's still around, to join us. Idayat. Then I will ask Dr. Jock after that. Ibrahim Sal is here. Ibrahim Sal Trust Africa, but of course we know him from Codestria days. And just let you know that Codestria are likewise streaming this occasion. I got a message from Godwin Murunga. So we are many of us, and I'm sure through Ibrima Trust Africa community are also on board. But Ibrahim, I would like you also to say something later on behalf of Trust Africa and Codestria. I'd like to welcome Tu Varaito Mpunga, somewhere out there in East Africa, Nancy Kachingwe, my sister Patricia McFadden, and many of you who are here, including Charles Ray, Hasu Patel, Amidi Daga from Mauritius, and so on, and my sister Maud Blair from the UK, Zimbabwean, but living in the UK, the ward Mushabasa, Christoph Mukofa, who's always joining us in these sessions, also based in the UK. Is Idayat in? Idayat is from the Center for Democratic Development in Nigeria. I saw early on. If she's not there, may I call on Dr. Jog? Dr. Jog?
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. And it's a pleasure and such an honor to be on this platform with all of you, people I have admired from afar over the years. And I'm grateful that this call was brought to my attention so I could join. I don't really have so much more to add to the previous speakers, especially Adebayo, who gave a comprehensive overview of the situation. Other than to simply repeat what I put there in text, for those of you who are interested, and which is that there is no question that it's going to be an uphill battle to support the pro-democracy movements in Sudan. And Sudan, of most African countries, actually has an amazing history of civil society organizing and revolutionary protests to topple very powerful dictatorships. So I don't see any reason why they will not do the same currently with this effort to power grab. We need to really hone in on the best ways to keep them going with the protests, because these protests will prevail in the end. The caveat to that, of course, is every time a popular uprising in Sudan has succeeded in toppling the dictatorship, it has always been the military siding with the people, at least a large chunk of the military siding with the people or refusing to shoot at protesters. And so if that situation still remains with a large swath of the army, I can assure you the protests will succeed in preventing this coup from going forward. But if the military has already been hijacked, because this is a manufactured crisis that the coup is trying to solve. It's a manufactured crisis. They said that the civilian part of the government was not successful in containing the situation, solving the needs of the people, and but they were the ones who told the Beja in the Red Sea to block the road to Port Sudan. It was the military who told their elements to go and protest in front of the National Palace, and so they created the crisis in order to justify this power grab. But I think it is going to be a massive confrontation, and our fear is that people will die in large numbers if this confrontation continues for long and escalates, especially with regards to the SPLM North, to SLA, to SPLM North in Darfur, in Kordofan and in Blue Nile. I think these guys were party to the coalition government by virtue of the Juba peace agreement. Now you have two countries where the peace agreement in Juba is sponsored by Khartoum and the peace agreement in Khartoum is sponsored by Juba. So if the coup leaders are not respectful towards Juba, there is a chance that that peace agreement will collapse. And if it does, the movements, the revolutionary movements from the peripheries will have no choice but to go back to civil war. And that is the most ominous situation I can think of. And so as we put our heads together in ways of in how to support the pro-democracy forces in Sudan, we have to keep this possibility of a return to civil war in the back of our minds. I can't help but also point out that every time there is a kind of a Pan-African coalition of people trying to influence events in Sudan, a racial card always gets thrown in our faces by the Arab world. And we know that the current military coup is sponsored by Saudi Arabia, by Egypt, by UAE, because they have had money investments in that country. The security investment from Egypt, including trying to use Sudan as a buffer against Ethiopia with regards to the Renaissance Dam. There's no question that Egypt wants a military leadership in that country. UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are partners in the war in Yemen, are using Sudanese soldiers in that coalition against Al-Houthis. Now, if the military is out of the picture in Sudan, such collaboration might not continue. Therefore, Saudi Arabia and UAE want a military power. Now, if that is going to be a confrontation between the Arabs and the Africans, we all know where the power lies. The power is always about money. And the Pan-African solidarity to help Sudanese people is going to fall short of what it takes to revamp the solidarity on the ground, which is about money. And we know the Arab world is going to invest more in Sudan, and we will be told off. You are Africans. Okay, so Sudan has been expelled from the African Union. What is that going to affect Sudan It doesn't. So we have to reckon, we have to come to terms with the realities of the Afro-Arab relations on the African continent, even as we remember the role of some powerful Arab leaders like Muammar Gaddafi, like Jamal Abdel Nasser, being so convinced of the need for Africans to work together. That effort was always undercut by Afro-Arab politics, which is racial politics. So mine is just a reminder of the complexities and the nuances of this relationship as we try to find a way to support our brothers and sisters in Sudan. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. It was very useful intervention on your part. Also reminding us of the realities, the geopolitical realities in the part of the world, in the Sudan, and the scaring reality of the Afro-Arab relations, which are not often discussed in the open, but I think have been very helpful. Idayat, is Idayat there? While I'm calling on Idayat, I'm also renewing my invitation to Ibrima Sal to help us in the discussion. Idayat, and any other of our panelists who might be in the room? Idayat? I'd like also to apologize for Nzongola and Talaja. We've just been appointed the UN ambassador, DRC ambassador to the UN. He was caught up in class as well today, but he sends his good wishes and subscribes to this meeting in full. We'll ask Ibrima Sal to come join us.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Ibo, and greetings everybody. And And thank you for the initiative of bringing us together to discuss this crisis in Sudan and what to do about it. And I know you were working very closely with Abdoulaye Bachili of Senegal, who was also having sleepless nights since this thing began, like I think many people on this continent. I don't have actually much to add. I think the analysis that we've had is really so deep and pertinent, deep understanding of the dynamics in Sudan, and has been very helpful in putting the current crisis in context. I think Bio is also even in a better place to speak about Kodesria than me. He was my boss when I was head of research. He was the executive secretary, and he is already also right now the chair of the scientific committee of Kodesria. So I guess Kodesria has spoken already through his own voice again. So there are many other people who are part of the Kodesria community here. And I think I just want to say that I think it is very important that we are making this demonstration of solidarity, Pan-African solidarity. I think this is really the minimum we ought to be doing at this stage. In addition to all the efforts that could be made to make sure that safety and security is guaranteed to those who are on the front line. The specter of coup d'etats, we thought we had managed to, sort of keep out of the African scene. But we've seen them coming back. We've seen so many of them in the last 2 years, right? Sudan, this is the second one in a few years. And then we've seen Mali and Guinea. The challenge is to make sure that we don't have more coups coming. And the big challenge definitely is to make sure that we don't have more of them coming. I think the characterization that Bio has made of the coup as an opportunistic coup, and this and like the others is a very pertinent one. And it's also maybe where we have a sign of hope, in the sense that these coups are coming, following popular uprisings in most instances. The masses say, look, we are tired of the hardships, we are tired of the abuses of human rights and of, and we want better living conditions, we want better futures. And a lot of young people, social movements of young people and women on the forefront. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that. And what one sees in Sudan today, with the fact that people are coming out to challenge the coup when it is still almost like happening in a sense, is a sign of hope. In Mali, the coup also followed a lot of protest movements by it's sort of mixed forces in civil society, but in the end, it was really following an expression of dissatisfaction with the state of affairs in the country by the people, and we see that happening in many other places, and that's what led to the collapse of the dictatorships that we had, in other countries of the continent as well. And I think that's probably also what we should be looking at, to see how to strengthen those forces, how to strengthen the movements of young people, the social movements and civil society movements, and make sure that we factor in the possibility of having these, interventions of the army and military in the politics of our countries, as we work towards, more democratic forms of change. The second thing we should also remember is that actually, and I think that has been also very clear in the analysis that was made, that the underbelly of all this, the soft underbelly of all this, are the economic systems and the economic issues. People go out in the streets to protest because of the lack of opportunities, because of the lack of jobs, because of the poverty and exclusion. And those issues are far from being resolved. And even if the military is using that as an excuse for saying, like, look, the civilians have been incapable of resolving the issues, I think there are structural conditions that, definitely we have to learn to deal with. Which is where when one interrogates the democratic politics that is, at play on the continent, is one looks at the programs of political parties. So, what has been presented to people in terms of elections, you really look for alternative ways of dealing with the economic issues, alternative ways of dealing with the challenge of inequality, the global challenges that our continent is faced with. And I think, beyond the current crisis, That is what, I think politics on this continent need to reconnect with democratic forces, progressive forces in particular. We are in the context of the Sudan, a regime led by somebody like Hamdok, who is very familiar with these issues, who is a very, very progressive scholar, who has had time to reflect on these issues when he was with UNECA, but he definitely didn't have, the room for maneuver that he needed, and the resources and the possibility to act and implement the policies that would have helped in making a difference. So I think it's a lot of things that maybe we should be taking up in our respective organizations and coming together also, that we should be pushing forward in a much more forceful way in terms of the debates on the continent on alternatives to the current economic conditions, rethinking economics, rethinking, challenging the orthodoxies that are somewhere there still, and that regimes succeed one another in power, but end up implementing for a whole host of reasons. Part of it be coming from the pressures that they're under, but also part of it being that maybe the people are not organized well enough, or probably structuring the movements in such a way that they would take up those economic issues in a new way, and in a way that would enable them to hold on over a longer period in terms of managing the resources of the continent in ways that make them benefit the people of the continent, more than any other person. So I'm in full support of the idea of having a declaration or something adopted, following this particular, roundtable. But also maybe making sure that we find channels of communication with the African Union and those on the continent who have also spoken out, against the coup and calling for the reinstatement of the regime. The likelihood, what we could fear is that, they would, appoint a new government made up of people who are much closer to them, and then they would say, okay, look, we are still having the transition continuing in one way or the other, but the forces that are more in favor of democracy would be pushed on the side, and the Hamdoks may find it difficult to be brought back to power. But I think that should be one of the people we should be calling for. The things we should be calling for is for the reinstatement of Hamdok and this regime. So just thank you all for putting together this great panel in a short period of time, and for the expression of solidarity.
Thanks, Ibrahima. Thanks also for helping organize this meeting. You're very modest. You're very central. You and Abdullahi Batili, who thanks to the poor palace nature of our communication system on the continent, he's stuck somehow out there, can't link in. I'd like to welcome David Johnson from Trinidad and Tobago, who just joined us. Also, we're having a very precarious link, but welcome, David, never too late. Then we have also my in Shuai. I see you there. You want to say something later? You're welcome. In the meantime, I call on your partner, Brian Kagoro, last but not least in this discussion. I'm assuming that Hidayat is not to be seen anyway, she's disappeared, and that none of the other panelists are on board. If they are on board, please indicate, and you can join us and speak after Brian Kagoro. Brian Kagoro, well known to all of us on this platform, Zimbabwean, but mostly Pan-African. Brian.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you. It's good seeing all the Pan-Africanists. I think there are a set of key questions, and thanks, Bayo, for that framing, and thanks to Jock, and thanks to Brima, thanks to Elinor, thanks to Karine for the framing that they have done. What we are seeing is an interplay of several factors, as already indicated. And those several factors lend themselves to very specific questions about the nature of solidarity that we need to ourselves think about. Let me reframe some of those issues for purposes of moving us forward. Clearly, there is an issue of a militarized, racialized, and financialized coup d'etat, which is politically mortgaged, but equally politically mortgaged, as others have said, was the transitions. The interplay of interest in the Sudanese transition presents several challenges: conceptual, ideological, and practical. First, I think that it is fair to say, and those who are in the American Foreign Service will accept, that the Euro-American interests over-projected themselves at the moment of Sudan's transition. Given some of the sweeter deals they were willing to make with Bashir before he was deposed, they encumbered the new government in ways that made it appear as though they had more control. So the visceral reaction that you saw from the opponents of the Euro-American interests is something that must be appreciated. An over-projection by Euro-American interests and also a counter-projection by other interests. And I would say this was ideologically contaminated the moment of transition. A transition authored by the agency of Sudanese without foreign help, and transition authored as part of the history that Jock has described of resistance to military rule and resistance that has been costly, contaminated by this overexertion. It was an agenda of almost a romantic attempt to try and fossilize and microwave a particular type of liberalism in the transition or in the democracy that was emerging. So this has led many to ask, and I see that Varaidzo has asked the same question: is Sudan democracy ready? Is the state ready? Is the economy ready? Is society ready? Is the securocracy ready? And is there a possibility that this coup would be sanitized? And once it's sanitized, that African Union will do exactly what we did in Chad, in Mali, and elsewhere. Take the de facto situation, and of course, as happened in Zimbabwe on the 17th of November 2017, take the de facto situation as the de jure situation. But the Sudanese context is complicated, as all the other speakers have said, by the interests of Egypt, and those interests extend to its Grand Renaissance Dam interests, but they go beyond. They go beyond the Nile Basin historical feuds. They go into what Egypt sees as its own domestic security and what it will take to guarantee that security in the face of the threats that it thinks it is facing. And of course, I think Jock and others have talked about UAE, Saudi Arabia. And this growth of militarism and militarization that's linked to the broader Mediterranean region, and that's worth tackling as a matter of solidarity. And then, of course, it raises bigger questions that go beyond the Sudan about these transitional arrangements, governments of national unity, inclusive governments, in which you have this uneasy bedfellows. And the curious role that the AU and the UN have played is either as undertakers who come to embalm dead bodies, or as marriage officers who come to bless a forced marriage. And the lack of a clear normative framework to deal with these situations, whether arising out of mass protest, as Ebrima said, or arising out of a genuine or transition, or those situations arising out of coup. The AU has dithered at the point of principle, and we thank God it made some position on the Sudan. But it's worth noting that the bigger challenge, and Varaidzo raised this in her chat, there were no guarantors for the Sudan transition, as there were no guarantors in many other transitions. And in South Sudan, which is a more precarious transition, the guarantors that had been set, of course, were required and were monitored and were replenished. It seems to me, therefore, that the question of Afro-Arab solidarity and disconnect, the geopolitical as well as the racial dimensions of it, and the question of how best to mediate in this situation, given the various components of challenges that we've referred to, and in various geographic and other spaces, whether it's Kordofan, Blue Nile, and etc., and the militia, and so on and so forth. I want to suggest the following. There was already a statement issued by civil society groups to which many have signed on, that it may be useful to have a look at that statement. And there was a statement already done by Defend the Defenders. It may not carry the sort of politics because it focused purely on getting the UN human rights system to consider this matter. But I think that they are worth supporting these efforts because they get some action out of the UN and the AU. But I want to suggest, Ivo and colleagues, that Karin, when she talks of mass mobilization online and offline, we cannot take it for granted that the actions we take with respect to Sudan are in essence expressions of our seriousness to ensure that this malady does not replicate itself in all our countries, where if military folks are unhappy with the state of politics, contrary to the constitutional requirement that they be under civilian control, and contrary to the expectation that they would always act in the interest of citizens, they could and would and will act in the interest of either their foreign handlers or their own self-interest, as self-actors, in overthrowing the constitution and taking fundamental actions to determine, without any form of democratic control, which citizens would be part of that. So in order to stop this, I think that there are normative frameworks of the African Union. It is about time that citizens pronounce themselves on this issue. If for no other reason, for the reason already given, that the number of human lives lost in order to achieve the Sudanese revolution demand that this be a matter too important to be left to the Sudanese alone. And this is a matter in which we must reach out across the continent, east, west, north, south, and central. And Sudan is not the only one. As we take solidarity on Sudan, we pronounce ourselves on Ethiopia. We pronounce ourselves on Eswatini. We pronounce ourselves on Mali and Guinea. We pronounce ourselves on Chad, on matters we feel that the leadership has not handled in terms of its own normative framework, the AU shared values. But as citizens, we're custodians of those shared values. So we can organize virtually as we are doing today. And I think this type of organizing needs to be expanded. We need to reach out to colleagues in the media to ensure that the media captures the right narrative about what is happening in the Sudan. But there are very clear demands with respect to the Sudan, which is the release of the Prime Minister from house arrest, the reinstatement of civilian authority, and of course to ensure that any inclusive arrangement is an arrangement that's not subject to the control of those that wield the guns, but is subject to the control of a broader set of actors. And there's a formula, there's a process that's not directed from a barrack. And I think that beyond those demands, releasing all political prisoners, investigating instances of violation of those citizens who've been ill-treated in the process by being unlawfully arrested by the military, and also addressing broader questions of accountability in the economy and elsewhere, both domestic and foreign players. But I think we need to address ourselves to the foreign actors, the ones mentioned, as well as the Europeans and the Americans. There are certain actions that they take that may undermine any prospects of transition. They may seem to make sense in Washington and may even make sense in Whitehall or in Paris or in Bonn. But ultimately, their net impact on the ground is to undermine the hard sweat, the blood of the martyrs that died to liberate the country from the Bashir rule. I want to end by saying, Ivo, that practical solidarity demands that beyond the virtual and physical organizing and the media work that we would do, we ask ourselves, what will it take to practically support the families of those activists who are being shot on the streets, being arrested? I do not suppose that we will have all the resources as individuals, but we need to make it clear that an injury to one is an injury to all. We also need to make it clear that we are the Sudan revolution. And the Sudan revolution is the African revolution. It applies to Zimbabwe, applies to Lesotho, applies everywhere. So Ibo, with those words, I just want to call us beyond the statements to say we now need, as people who are Pan-African conscious, or are conscious Pan-Africanists, to have a very practical, structural way of responding to this growing cancer across our continent. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks. Wonderful summary, wonderful draft already in terms of resolutions. And we'll just have to ask you, Brian, to, although of course this thing is recorded, and as people who have been guests and participants on this platform, the policy dialogue is recorded, it is transcribed, and it's published subsequently. But we'd ask Brian perhaps to put something on paper along the lines is just outlined, form of resolution, which we can circulate post this meeting and develop some kind of consensus and more importantly, a practical position with respect to the Sudan. Also grateful, Brian, that you made mention that Africa as a whole is in crisis. And if Ibrima had left out Zimbabwe as a coup area, it is one of the first coups that the AU ignored, overlooked. And as someone warned at the time, coups beget coups. But essentially, we have learned in the contemporary situation, at least, that coups are implicitly, explicitly an expression against democratic forces. And they come in always as saviors, restoring legacy in the case of Zimbabwe, or as Buran said in the case of the Sudan, that the military intervened to stave off a civil war. That's nothing new in terms of the claims that the military make in taking over power. We have heard it all, and we will ask those of you who want to say a few words to come in. Anybody? Amidi?
Well, no, thanks, Ibo. I think the previous speakers from Adebayo to Jock to Brian and others who have spoken, Cecilia, Sisulu, I've said it all. I obviously I'm in full support of the initiative. I particularly have thoughts for our comrade Abdallah. Abdallah and I, we've been working a lot from UNECA time. Abdallah came to Mauritius, I took him to Seychelles on the whole governance promotion program. In fact, just before he left for Sudan, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with him, and he was truly a real nationalist going on a mission for his country in the context of a civilian government, in the context of a new democracy to emerge. So yes, I'm in support. Yes, we need to express the solidarity in all ways possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Amidi. Those who may not know Amidi Daga, we belong to the old African Association of Political Science, along with some of the people who were supposed to be on this panel, Elmi Sharawi, I think communication problem, Nzongola Ntalaja, Peter Yang Nyongo, all these were in support of this meeting, and we know they're together with us in this venture. Anyone else want to speak?
Let me put on my video. My name is Wansa, and I'm new in this space. This is my first one. And
the name again?
Wansa Kyoko.
Oh,
Kyoko.
okay.
Yes.
Oh.
So I'm new to this space, and mine is not to repeat what people have said, but one of the things that are very concerning is when you watch what happened with Amdok, and he couldn't even levy taxes. And a big part of the time after the revolution was spent trying to put certain conditions into place, and there was no money to enable him to at least roll out economic recovery measures for his people. And you know, a new government like that needs some time to be able to overcome the resistance by local officials all the way to the ground. He couldn't even levy taxes. They were sabotaging him for a very long time. And why are we as Africans unable to have a fund that sits somewhere? Is it the Africa Development Bank? It's, I don't know where. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but I feel we failed Abdok from day one. Part of the, after the revolution, the biggest campaign should have been availing Abdok with enough resources to keep the people happy until he's able to consolidate power. But we spend so much time do that, ICC, that. I'm not saying ICC is not important, but that should have been like the first thing, a Marshall Plan for Sudan. But Washington and the rest of them were just asking, change that before we give you money. And that was wrong. We should have said, give them money. They need money now until he's able to politically overpower all the people who are resisting his government. And I think going forward, we need to really find a way. Where do we, a fund that can easily be mobilized, where can it sit? And our governments should be persuaded to be putting money there. I know they don't fund the African Union even, they resist that as well. But we have to wake up. What has happened in Sudan is Africa has no friends. You have to be your friend first, to befriend yourself first before you have other friends from outside. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to think, even if not for us, of our children and their children, can there be some money somewhere for responding to crises like this economically, so that we can stabilize our nations, so that we don't give anybody space to cook what Brian called neoliberal spaces, economically or politically. And if we don't like that, but if we don't like it, then let us be ready for it. And we have to learn from now and start now, even if it is, we have to think, even if it's thinking through, even if we don't have the money, we have to think through these things. We have to. Thank you.
Thanks, Wanza. Wanza, where are you from, Wanza? I know.
I'm Kenyan.
Asante, habari gani?
Nzuri sana.
Karibu. Anyone else? After Wanza? Thanks, Wanza, for your statement. Anybody else? Patricia, from another, maybe we shouldn't involve you in this at this stage. Anybody else?
There's a hand up, Ibo. Filani.
Filani? I don't see the hand. Filani, please come in.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibo. I think this was very insightful. I just want to say that democracy, to me, must remain an institution for the people, by the people. And what we are seeing in Africa, as Brian said, should take us back to reframe conceptually in terms of what others have been calling waves of democratization. I remember Sudan a few years back, we had a number of scholars saying that Africa is actually in the fourth wave of democratization from the third wave of democratization as suggested by Huntington then. I think what is happening here is that we really taking one step forward at a moment and perhaps 3 or 4 steps back. And there's need to really confront this reality and not to keep on a linear teleological conceptual pose line that Africa is on some path toward democratization. And my worry is that this is not going to be the last military coup in Africa in the next few years. And as far as I know, it won't be surprising if Zimbabwe is going to have another military coup as well. One military coup begets another. And we have seen that elsewhere in Mali and so forth. So my emphasis is that we need to be conceptually clear that what is happening in Africa now is totally democratic regression. And all the celebrations about waves of democratization are kind of pose. And the warning is that these military coups do not just start by the military stepping into civilian issues, but we have leaders who start deploying the military to deal with civilian matters where they would have lost control. We saw that in Zambia, though it didn't culminate in a coup, where the former president Edgar Lungu deployed the military. We have seen that happening in South Africa. We are seeing it all over. Most of the governments don't have sustainable solutions to the problems bedeviling Africa, and they think the military is the ultimate solution. But what it does, it emboldens the military in the long term, and they feel that they are wielders of power and not the citizens. Let me end there, Professor Ibo.
Thanks, Tejara. Thanks very much. I see Muthoni, Wanyeki, and then Tony. Please come in. Muthoni, how about pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah, it's a pretty common Kenyan name. Thank you so much, everybody, for all of the insights, and especially Bio for the more historical kind of run into the more recent day events. I have a couple of things to say that are partly practical on sort of solidarity suggestions, but also more things I think we need to think through and have clear positions on in terms of sort of what's being advocated as a sort of solution on the way forward. On practical and urgent solidarity messages, as you all know, Saturday is the day that they've called for, that the protest movement, Forces for Freedom of Change, have called for the massive nationwide protest, and all the unions have called for a general strike. And I think that's going to be a day of extreme risk for protesters. And maybe, you know, this group is the wrong generation to get things going, but it would be amazing if we could see across Africa a real kind of, you know, support online for sort of protect the protesters on that day. Or some kind of action that is alert to the fact that that is probably where one of the biggest crackdowns will happen. In terms of the general strike, I mean, I think Eleanor pointed it out, we're also stressed by our own situations, and also, you know, also economically sort of hit by, you know, 2 years of COVID. But if the general strike persists, which it seems like it will, there's going to be real need within the country to keep the protest movement going. And of course, the last time around, Sudanese and the diaspora were amazing in terms of organizing brigades of medical supplies, food, and so on, money coming in. Right now, the money channels are shut down, but that's also something that we could think of as a longer term kind of support to keep the protest movement going if this thing prolongs, as I'm sure it's going to. And then the last sort of practical issue is, other than suspending the Sudan from the AU, they are sending a mission in on Monday, and this group I think would be really well placed to put in a very concrete and sort of detailed and nuanced kind of set of suggestions before they go in. And I say that because, you know, even on this call, some of the calls have been for dialogue, but they had already dialogued. They already had the transitional arrangements through the constitutional declaration, through Juba. The timelines were clear. The military was meant to be out of government next month, which is no doubt why they have made this kind of move that they have. And in a way, the sort of attempted coup a couple of weeks ago, I feel really, we all understood it as sort of floating a balloon for a real coup, but actually what it did was open up the doors for negotiation again of things that were already agreed in the first instance and then with the armed groups. And I really feel our position should be, These things have been negotiated. The transitional arrangements have been negotiated. This government needs to come back. The military needs to come out. But there is something that needs a sort of position on. I think that this group would be good to sort of think through. Another issue is on the externals. Everyone's talked about, you know, the usual Western suspects and the whole Gulf issue, but the one external who hasn't been raised, and, you know, we're struggling with how to sort of get around it, is Israel. Because Israel is really playing the role of a spoiler and a sort of intermediary and a sort of financer and supplier of arms to different sides of the armed groups. And there is some, I think we've begun to think of ways to sort of get into, talk to, deal with the Gulf. We haven't begun that kind of work when it comes to Israel. And then the last thing that sort of needs to be thought through really carefully is the cabinet is split. It's not all cabinet ministers that were arrested. And it's certainly, I think Jock was pointing this out, it's not all armed groups that are on the streets like SPLM North that have called for the people to join the general strike and the protests. Especially the Darfuri armed groups are sitting quite prettily with the military. And I think we need some sort of nuance of which of the parties are where and which of the armed groups are where and why. Again, to sort of, you know, avert Jock's big fear, but also to have a clear position on sort of what next steps forward are. And again, that's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone, for hosting this and for speaking.
Well, thanks, Mutoni. That's very, very, very interesting. Brian, please take note in drafting your statement for us. Tony Rila, then I'll ask the panelists, at least those who spoke, 2 minutes each as we wind up. Tony Rila.
Thank you, everybody. I think that this has been an immensely rich discussion, not merely about Sudan, but about Africa generally. And I'd like to link something that Eleanor said and link it to what Brian said. We're not dealing with events, we're dealing with processes. And when we went back, Eleanor went back to the 60s and the whole process of decolonizing Africa, we were not dealing with events in all these countries, we were dealing with a process. We're now dealing with a process right across the continent, and we need to join the dots, exactly as Brian is saying, that we need to see that the events happening in all these countries have common links. And I think Bio richly described those links there, and that this is the core of the kind of solidarity that we need to begin to develop. And whether you have a hard coup in Sudan or a soft coup in Zimbabwe, we still face the dilemma of how do we remove authoritarian forms of government built on the colonial legacy and transform the kinds of institutions, and particularly to create the conditions in which the military remain absolutely clearly under civilian control. These are very serious issues. So we can't ignore Sudan, and we must provide the strongest solidarity, but we must provide the same solidarity in Eswatini, in Zimbabwe, and everyone else. And this is where civil society, I think, has to develop a very Pan-Africanist view. And I think one of the things that's happened is that much of civil society in Africa is now at the behest of what Brian quite rightly called the Euro-US support, on the basis of what Bio talked about as the neoliberal agenda linked to democracy and human rights and rule of law. But we're not developing the authentic kind of solidarity that civil society has to have in a Pan-Africanist view. I think we have to start somewhere. And this is a good example of for us in civil society right across Africa to begin to develop exactly this kind of solidarity. So I hope that my erudite colleague Brian will get his pen out and start to produce something that pulls the notion of this is both an event but it's also a process. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. But I don't want to have to ask you, the expanders, to come back unless you really feel so. Otherwise, I'll ask Bayo and Brian to give us the last few words on the occasion and the way forward. I'll begin with Brian, and Bayo, the last word.
I really don't have much to add. I've noted the points that Mdoni has made, that Tony has made, that Karine and others made earlier. Don't worry, I will reach out to Karine and to Hidayat, even if she didn't, even though she didn't speak, and to you, Tony, and to Bayo, and then we will come up with a statement. I think some things are time bound, which is what Mdoni was suggesting. The AU has this mission. We need to have something for that. Other things, I think we are more not that they have a lot of time, and some very practical questions on the Saturday related solidarity that may require small groups to dialogue about, and maybe the invitation. I see people like Jana and Nancy and others, and Nozipo and even Wanza on the call and joke. So maybe a smaller group could think about specific pan-continental, and I would dare say even within the US, North America, Europe, and elsewhere. So continent plus solidarity. It just needs some form of coordination, and we can think about that. But otherwise, Ibo and everybody that's organized this, thank you so much for gathering us. Beyond the statement, I think that we can have the bilaterals on the practical solidarity. Bayo, I think you and I can talk as well as the other colleagues that I referred to. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks very much indeed. Bayo.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And I'll come back to you. His hand is up.
Yeah, it has been very useful. It's always good to have an opportunity to share with colleagues. It releases some of the frustration, some of the pain, and to do so with comrades of many years standing is particularly, I think, empowering at this time. I would definitely want to second Mutoni's proposal that for the immediate, please let's keep the 30th on our radar. The military will do everything possible to break the will of the people on the 30th. But it's also going to be a day of massive mobilization within the Sudan itself, and to the extent to which we can, in various ways, both online and physically, support the democratic forces within the country. It will be really helpful. Early information, of course, is that the military are looking for ways also, and it's good that we've been alerted to the fact that there are armed groups that also support the military, and that even in some instances, as I indicated, orchestrated the events by making calls for a military intervention. They would try to organize a counter demonstration. Early efforts that they deployed 2 days ago didn't seem to work, gather enough traction, and the overwhelming sentiment is in support of the transitional government of Abdallah Hamdok. For the AU delegation, I think as many of us as have the possibility to reach out to particularly the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Bankole Adeoye, should do so. I had a brief chat with him in Kigali. He came briefly to Kigali for a meeting, and we ran into each other. So I've offered to give him a scenario analysis as an input into the preparation of his mission. But I think as many of us as are able to reach him, Brian, Mutoni, and a whole host of others. Please let's do so. Partly also because he's going to be managing a Peace and Security Council in which the military have allies. And it was a bit of a miracle that at the end of the day, the majority voice was for the suspension of Sudan from the councils of the AU. Day before yesterday, the debate went on to about 11 p.m. at this time, and it was stalemated because the military had and not an insignificant number of African countries actually supporting them, that it was not a coup. So we need to work on that front and bolster those within the commission who would need arguments to help us. Thank you.
Thanks, Bayo. Thanks very much indeed for being the anchor on this program too, and helping us and also indicating the way forward. Eleanor? Eleanor?
Yes, thinking of the 30th, just in terms of the shortness of time, Twitter is the lowest hanging fruit. So I think the Twitterati, if we can please make sure that we at least spend, if nothing else, at least spend Saturday on Twitter. And I don't know if there's an expert on setting up the first salvo of tweets, if they can do that and the rest of us follow. I think those of us who have contacts with our own ministers of international relations or foreign affairs, to at least give them a call and say, you know, what are you doing? And also to the journalists that we know. And then, I'm really hopefully maybe that there can be a statement that we can sign on by the 30th.
Great. Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks indeed.
Ibo, before you close.
Yes.
So if there are Varaizo and all the other more savvy people who can help set up a Twitter chat for Friday and Saturday, and we expand the sort of panels, include the younger comrades, maybe they should volunteer through you and Ruth and others who are on here, and then we can take it up. If people want to volunteer to be part of Twitter chats, to host Twitter chats, then let's do that. We keep, and if the SAPES media folk are there, they can help as well. We can work with them together with other comrades, yeah.
We'll do our part, but we seek your assistance in the process. Thanks very much. We come to the end of the event, and it leaves me just to thank every one of you, especially those who have led the discussion. Bayo, Karine, Eleanor, Jock, and Brian. Thank you very much, and Ibrima, and all of you who have come on this platform today to discuss. And I think it is an important meeting, one of the first that we ever had in solidarity with a crisis situation on the continent. And there are many crises, many. We should try and institutionalize the manner in which we respond to this crisis, as we've done in the past, especially during the anti-apartheid days. Let this be the beginning, but not the end. Thank you and good night. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Karine.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Karine.
Bye, Karine. Bye, Brian. Brian has sent a message.
And you're calling.
Yeah.
And also,
Micheline, I saw your message. Huh? I'll send you a message.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I'll send you a message. Yeah.
Let's keep in touch, Karine.
Okay.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Jock, bye-bye.
Somebody has put a WhatsApp number there. Who's it?
Bye. Maud.
That's Akwasi.
That's Akwasi, yeah?
Yeah.
Africa, Africa. na kati koteka pasi. Na pasi oyo ya boye kai na bana mawa na kokate. Basusu oyo na ponaka bawela bokonzi pena babwatilio. Bavoti tango ekomaka kai na komi moto pona